My name is Nell Farrow and I'm 36 years old. I restore old houses for a living. I have stripped wallpaper in 12 counties, repointed brick in weather that had no business being worked in, and talked more than one client out of ruining a perfectly good Victorian with the wrong paint color. I have spent my career putting things back the way they were meant to be. The one building I had to fight to keep was a farmhouse in the Cotswolds that belonged to my grandmother before it belonged to me. This is what happened when my husband's family decided it belonged to them. I walked through the gate on a Thursday morning in late October. There were 2 cars in the yard I did not recognize. Kitchen window was lit. The back door was not only unlocked but standing open, which my grandmother would not have stood for. I had come to take measurements for a repair to the dairy ceiling. I had been there alone 11 days earlier. What I found inside was my sister-in-law Georgina on my grandmother's settle with a laptop and a glass of something that smelled of the good gin I kept in the cabinet above the sink. Beside her, a woman I had met once at a birthday party in Bristol, and at the kitchen table a third woman I had never seen before with a notepad and a printed checklist. Georgina looked up. She smiled. "My mother-in-law has been talking to some people," she said. "Just getting a few ideas down. This house will come to us eventually anyway." I set my bag on the flagstone floor. I took out my phone. I took a photograph of the 3 women, the gin glass, the notepad, and the back door standing open. Then I turned around, walked back out, and drove to a lay-by on the B4425 where I sat with both hands on the wheel and rang my solicitor. What I did in the following 48 hours, and what happened at a Sunday lunch I had not been invited to but attended anyway, is the reason I am telling this story. Subscribe if you are new here. Drop a comment. Stay with me. Let me start from the beginning. My grandmother, Joan Farrow, was born in 1934 in the farmhouse she died in. She had grown up in it, married my grandfather in its front parlor, raised my mother and her brother in it, and when my grandfather died in 1998 she had continued managing the farm's 40 acres alone in the particular manner of women of her generation who simply got on with it. She was a small woman with strong hands and opinions about everything, most of which turned out to be right. She taught me to read a room the way a builder reads a wall, which is to say you look for what is concealed before you trust what is visible. I spent my school holidays at the farm. I spent them learning the difference between a load-bearing wall and a partition, between sound joinery and the kind that looks right until you put weight on it. She taught me that structures fail from neglect rather than from drama, slowly at the joints in the places nobody thought to look. She left me the farmhouse and the yard and the dairy and the 3 kitchen gardens. She left the 40 acres to my Uncle David on my mother's side, which was its own arrangement and not my story to tell. She left the farmhouse to me specifically in terms that her solicitor, a man named Philip Ward who had handled the family's affairs for 30 years and who had the unhurried manner of someone who had heard most things, described as unusually explicit. I remember the afternoon in Philip's office, a Tuesday in March 3 years ago, the week after the funeral. He slid a folder across the table and said, "Before you read the will, read the letter at the back. Your grandmother wrote it herself 6 months ago. She had it witnessed here." The letter was 2 sides of cream writing paper in Joan's handwriting, which was economical and slanted slightly to the left. I still have it. I know large sections of it by heart. Nil. I am leaving you the farmhouse because you will look after it properly, which is the only reason to leave a house to anyone. I am also leaving you this instruction. The house is in your name alone. Not in your name and Robert's name in yours. I have nothing against Robert. He is a kind man. But I have watched his mother for 3 years and I know the shape of her intentions. She has visited this house 4 times and each time she has looked at it the way people look at something they are planning to rearrange. I will not have that happen. If I had wanted her to have access to this farm, I would have arranged it. I did not arrange it. Philip has the deed. Philip has my instructions. Call him before you speak to anyone about this, and call him especially before you speak to Sandra Holt. She had written Sandra's name. She had known exactly who was coming. I did not tell Robert about the letter. Not because I was hiding it from him, but because Philip had been clear that it was mine and private, and because I wanted to understand what it meant before I tried to explain it to anyone else. I kept it in the same manila folder as the deed, in the filing drawer of my desk at the workshop. Stayed there untouched for 2 years and 11 months. Let me tell you about Robert's family. Sandra Holt was a woman who understood property as the primary language of love and position. She had grown up in a 3-bedroom semi in Swindon and had spent her adult life arranging things upward. She had married well, in the sense that Robert's father Geoffrey had made a reasonable amount of money from a regional haulage business he had built in the 90s and then sold at the right time. They lived now in a new-build village outside Cheltenham that Sandra had furnished in a style she called classic country, which had nothing to do with the country and everything to do with the Farrow and Ball color chart used without restraint. She hosted Sunday lunches the way other people chair meetings. She had opinions about everything to do with her son's life, and she expressed them in the careful vocabulary of a woman who has learned that what cannot be said directly can be said as concern. Georgina was Robert's younger sister. 28, worked in events in Bristol, recently engaged to a man named Felix who had money from somewhere his family preferred not to specify. Georgina had decided, the week of the engagement, that she wanted a country wedding. She had been to the farmhouse twice and had referred to it both times as the perfect backdrop, which is a word that told me everything I needed to know about how she understood it. Not a home. A backdrop. Something to stand in front of. Robert, my husband. Good man. Genuinely. He loved me clearly, and he loved his family reflexively, and the conflict between those two things had been producing a low-grade friction in our marriage for 4 years that neither of us had named clearly. He was the kind of man who settled things by not surfacing them, who called his mother every Sunday at 11 and relayed the conversation back to me as information rather than as the negotiation it clearly was. He did not mean harm by it. He had simply grown up in a family where accommodation was the primary skill, and had not yet fully understood that accommodation practiced consistently enough begins to look like consent. I had known for 6 months that Sandra wanted the farmhouse for Georgina's wedding. She had mentioned it first as a hypothetical. Wouldn't it be wonderful? She had mentioned it second as a suggestion. Have you thought about? She had mentioned it third as an assumption. When we used the farm, I had not offered it. I had not said yes or no. I had changed the subject 3 times and told Robert twice that if his mother raised it again I would need to be direct with her. Both times he had said he would handle it. Both times the handling had consisted of Sandra continuing to operate on the assumption that the answer was eventually going to be yes. In October, Georgina's engagement party had been held at the farmhouse. I should be precise here. I had agreed to host an afternoon gathering of 30 people in the kitchen garden on the first Saturday of October. Not a full venue hire. Not exclusive use. An afternoon in the garden with my presence, and with my explicit understanding that the arrangements were mine to manage. What had happened was that Sandra had rung a marquee company on the Thursday before without telling me, had arranged a catering van, had sent a printed order of service to 42 people listing the venue as the Farrow family farm, Bourton-on-the-Water, and had organized a photographer who had arrived at 8 in the morning and begun arranging things in rooms I had not agreed to open. I had spent that Saturday managing what I could and swallowing the rest, and on the Sunday evening I had sat in my workshop with a cup of tea going cold and written a 7-item list of specific things Sandra had done without my knowledge or consent and had dated it and photographed it with my phone. I had not shown it to anyone. If this is ringing something for you, stay with me. Subscribe if you have not. I need to tell you what I found at the farmhouse on that Thursday morning before I tell you what I built in the 48 hours after. The woman with the notepad at the kitchen table was, I found out from Georgina's Instagram that evening, a wedding planner from Stroud. Her name was Cassie. She had a website with a before and after section showing rural venues transformed, and she had, according to her most recent Instagram post, just visited a gorgeous stone farmhouse in the Cotswolds for a stunning 2025 autumn wedding consultation. She had tagged the location. She had been in my grandmother's farmhouse with a notepad and a checklist and a gin glass she had not been invited to fill. I rang Philip Ord from the lay-by. He answered on the third ring. Philip, I said, I need you to walk me through the position. He did not ask for context. He said, the property is registered in your name at HMLR. Sole owner, no restriction. Your grandmother's letter forms part of the supplementary title records. No one may use the property for any event or commercial purpose without your written consent. If they enter without your permission, they are trespassing. I said, they are in the building right now. He said, then you have the right to ask them to leave. If they don't, you call the police. Do you want me to prepare anything in writing? I said, yes. I want everything ready for Sunday. He said, Sunday meaning what exactly? I said, Georgina and Felix are having a family lunch at Sandra's on Sunday to discuss the wedding. Robert has been invited. I have not. Philip was quiet for a moment. He said, are you planning to attend? I said, I am planning to be at the farmhouse on Sunday at the time they have decided matters there will be discussed. He said, Holly. He called me Holly. He had known me since I was 7 years old, and I think the slip was affectionate. He said, I'll have everything ready by Saturday morning. He paused. Your grandmother was a very clever woman. She anticipated this precisely. I said I knew. He said, so did you, I think. You rang me from a lay-by rather than from your kitchen. I said, order matters. He said, come at 10 on Saturday. I drove home. Robert was in the kitchen making pasta. He had that look he had when he already knew something had happened but did not know how much. I told him. Not everything at once. Chronologically, which is the only way I know how to explain things. Cars in the yard. Georgina on the settle. The wedding planner at the kitchen table. The gin. The notepad. The Instagram post with my grandmother's farmhouse tagged as a venue in a planner's portfolio without my knowledge or consent. Robert said, I'll ring Georgie. I said, she has your mother's number. Who do you think arranged this? He looked at the pasta. He said, I didn't know. I said, I know you didn't know. That is a separate problem. He turned the hob down. He put both hands on the counter. He said, what do you need from me? I said, I need you to come with me on Saturday to meet with Philip Ord. Robert said, Philip as in the solicitor? I said, yes. Robert said, Holly, is this going to be very bad? I thought about that for a moment. I said, it is going to be very clear. He nodded. He dished up the pasta. We ate in the kind of silence that is not absence of conversation but the presence of something being processed by two people separately. That evening Sandra rang his mobile at 9:15. He answered. I heard one side. Yes, I know she was there. No, Mum, I'm not going to. I understand. It wasn't arranged with Nell. He paused. I said he should ring you. Another pause. No, Mum. He hung up. He sat down on the sofa. He said, she says it was an informal visit. She says Cassie is a friend of Georgina's and they just went to look. I said, did you tell her about Philip? He said, not yet. I said, I need her to find out on Sunday, not before. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, all right. He trusted me. He did not fully understand what he was trusting, but he trusted the shape of me. Saturday morning at Philip's office. 10 o'clock, the old stone building on the high street in Bourton with the brass plate outside and the smell of old paper and good ink that I had associated with serious things since childhood. Philip sat us at the meeting table and pushed a folder across to me. Inside, a copy of the registered title, a printed copy of my grandmother's letter with the witness signatures, a one-page legal summary of the property rights, and a document I had asked him to prepare, a formal notice of sole ownership addressed to Sandra Holt and Georgina Walsh Holt, setting out in plain language the legal position of the property and prohibiting use for any commercial or event purpose without my written consent, under civil trespass provisions. Philip said, the notice alone is sufficient to make the position clear. But I want you to read the attached summary before we discuss Sunday. I read it. Robert read it over my shoulder. Philip let us read. When we finished, he said, "3 things matter here. First, the title. Sole ownership is unambiguous. No one has any legal claim to this property or any right to arrange events there. Second, the engagement party in October. The Marquee Company has you on record as having consented to a gathering of 30. You did. You did not consent to a catering van, exclusive use, a professional photographer, or public listing as a venue. That is a record worth keeping. Third, and this is the piece that matters most practically, your mother-in-law's assumption that this property will come to her family eventually." He folded his hands. "Joan's letter anticipates this. Your grandmother took legal advice on this specific scenario. The letter forms part of the supplementary record. It is not merely sentimental. It is instructional." Robert said, "What does that mean practically?" Philip said, "It means that if Sandra Holt ever attempted to make a claim on the property through marriage, through intestacy arguments, through anything, the registered title and the supplementary letter together make it very difficult. The house is Nell's by specific and explicit legal arrangement. It was arranged this way on purpose." He looked at Robert without unkindness. "Your grandmother liked you, Robert. She simply knew what she was protecting." Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have said this out loud to my mother years ago." Philip said, "Yes, probably." He said it without judgment. Robert nodded. He did not look away. I asked Philip, "What about Sunday?" He said, "You have 2 choices. You send the notice by recorded post and let it arrive Monday. Or you go on Sunday and you let her read it in the room where she has been building her plans." He paused. "What does your grandmother's letter say about this?" I said, "She said to call Philip first and then speak to Sandra directly." Philip almost smiled. "Your grandmother wanted you to go on Sunday. She just wanted you to have the documents first." "I want to go on Sunday," he said, "then go." He gave me 2 copies of everything. Kept a third. He shook my hand and then Robert's. He said at the door, "The farmhouse is a very good building. I've admired it for 30 years. Look after it." "I will," I said. He already knew that. We drove back through the valley. October in the Cotswolds is the particular gold that happens when the light goes sideways through beech trees at 3 in the afternoon. Robert was quiet for the first 20 minutes. He was the kind of man who processed things by being still with them first, and I had learned over 4 years of marriage to give him the time that required rather than filling it. I looked at the dry stone walls running along the field edges, each one built from the stone turned out of that particular field and no other, the logic of it entirely local, every wall a record of what had been dug from the ground beneath it. My grandmother had said once that the walls told you more about the land than the fields did. The fields changed. The walls stayed. I had been thinking about that for 3 years without knowing what to do with it. The road came down through Bourton and then east, and Robert said, "My mother asked me in April whether you were planning to put the farmhouse in both our names." I said, "I know she did." He said, "I told her it wasn't her business." I said, "I know that too." He said, "I should have told her more than that. I should have said it's Nell's and it's staying Nell's, and if you ask again I need you to stop." I kept looking at the road. He said, "I didn't say that because saying it meant a version of choosing and I didn't want to choose. And by not choosing I chose anyway, just quietly in the wrong direction." I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm sorry." He said it plainly and specifically, which is the only way sorry is worth saying. I said, "I know." I put my hand on his knee. We drove the rest of the way listening to Radio 4 and not talking about Sunday, which had already been decided. Sandra's Sunday lunches were held at 12:30 precisely. She had been holding them for 20 years and they ran on a schedule that reflected her belief that reliability and control were essentially the same thing. Jeffrey carved. Sandra managed. Georgina and Felix arrived between 12 and 12:15. Robert and I arrived on time, which Sandra considered slightly early and noted with a smile. I had dressed in the way I dress for site visits when I am going to have a conversation about who owns what. Plain dark trousers, a gray merino, the small pearl earrings that had been my grandmother's. Nothing to demonstrate. Nothing to perform. My folder was in my bag in the inner pocket. Robert had not told them I was bringing it. The house smelled of roasting meat and the specific potpourri Sandra bought from the same shop in Cheltenham twice a year. The dining table was set for 6. A centerpiece of dried grasses and bronze chrysanthemums. Geoffrey's good wine glasses. An atmosphere that was warm enough in surface temperature to pass for easy if you were not looking at the undercurrent. Georgina was on the sofa with Felix's arm around her, both of them with the slightly glazed contentment of people who have been recently engaged and are still inhabiting the version of life in which everything arranges itself. Felix had a good handshake and eyes that noted things. I had spent enough time on building sites to recognize someone who was quietly reading a room. He was reading this one. Geoffrey said, "Nell, we don't see enough of you." He meant it genuinely. Geoffrey had always been straightforward in the way of men who have built something with their hands and have not confused it with being important. He liked me, I believe, because I worked with buildings and he respected that kind of work. He poured wine without asking and put a glass in front of me and one in front of Robert and asked about the dairy ceiling repair. I told him. He nodded and asked 2 sensible follow-up questions about lime mortar. Sandra watched this exchange from the kitchen doorway with the expression she wore when a conversation was not advancing her agenda. Lunch was served at 12:40. Roast lamb, roasted potatoes, green beans, gravy. Competence of the meal was not in question. Sandra cooked well because she did everything she decided to do well, and she had decided to cook well 30 years ago and had not revisited the decision. Conversation moved through Geoffrey's golf, Felix's company, the house Felix and Georgina were looking at in Clifton, and then Sandra said, "We've been thinking about the wedding." She said it looking at Georgina, but it was aimed at me. I set my fork down. I kept my hands on the table. I kept my face ordinary. Georgina said, "Cassie thinks the farmhouse could be absolutely stunning for late September. It's before the leaves go and the stone catches the afternoon light in that direction." She looked at me. "I know you were a bit surprised on Thursday." I said I was in. She said, "Yes, sorry about that. Mum said she'd cleared it with Robert." She looked at Robert. Robert looked at the table. Sandra said warmly, "Nell, we know it's your property. We know it was Joan's before. But family takes care of family. Georgina and Felix will treat it beautifully. Cassie is very experienced. We'd manage everything. You wouldn't need to lift a finger." I looked at her. She was wearing the expression she wore when she was being generous, which she distinguished from the expression she wore when she was being strategic, but which I had come to understand were the same expression from different angles. I said, "Sandra, before we talk about the wedding, I'd like to share something." I took the folder from my bag. I put it on the table. I put it on the white tablecloth between the centerpiece and the gravy boat, which is not where you put folders at a Sunday lunch in a house like this, and that displacement was deliberate because I had learned from buildings that sometimes you have to put the structural problem directly in the room before anyone will look at it. Sandra looked at the folder. She did not look at me. Felix looked at the folder. He looked at me. He looked at Georgina. Geoffrey refilled his wine glass. Robert put both hands flat on the table. I said, "This is the registered title for the farmhouse at Bourton." I took out the first document. I set it on the table so the heading was readable. Chem Land Registry. Title absolute. Registered proprietor Ellen Joan Farrow. That is my name. I have been sole registered owner since March of 3 years ago when my grandmother's estate was settled. I took out the second document. This is a supplementary letter, signed and witnessed, which my grandmother wrote 6 months before she died. It forms part of the title record. I placed it beside the first. Philip Ord, who has handled this family's legal affairs since 1993, holds a copy. Georgina said, "Nell, we know it's yours. We're not trying to take it. I said, I know you're not trying to take it. I'm telling you what it is so that we're all working from the same position. She looked at her mother. Sandra said, Philip Ward. I said, yes. He has held these documents since Joan's death. He has a copy of the title, the letter, and a formal notice I asked him to prepare this week. I took out the third document. I set it on the table. It was addressed to Sandra Holt and Georgina Walsh Holt. It was printed on Philip's firm's letterhead. It was 3 paragraphs. Sandra looked at the letter heading. She looked at her name. She looked at mine in the body of the text. She picked it up. She read it. I watched her read it. I had watched people read structural reports before. Takes about the same amount of time and produces about the same expression. She set it down. She said, a solicitor's letter. At a Sunday lunch. In my house. I said, at the lunch where you plan to discuss using my farmhouse for a wedding I've not agreed to. Her jaw moved. She looked at Robert. Robert. His voice was quiet and entirely level. Mum. The farmhouse is Nell's. It's always been Nell's. She said, I was trying to do something lovely for your sister. He said, I know. And I should have been clearer with you a long time ago that this wasn't your decision to make. She stared at him. The centerpiece sat between them. Chrysanthemums did not move. Felix put his fork down. He picked up the notice and read it through. He looked at me when he finished. He said, not unkindly, Georgina, did you know the visit on Thursday wasn't cleared with Nell? Georgina looked at her mother. Mum said it was fine. Felix looked at Sandra. Sandra said, it was an informal visit. Felix said, to take a wedding consultation at someone else's property. He said it without heat. He was a careful man. His parents were careful people. They had not arrived at a comfortable position by failing to read documents. He set the notice back on the table and looked at Georgina with the expression of a man who was revising something he had been told. Geoffrey said, Sandra. He said it simply. He had been married to her for 34 years, and he had the particular form of patience that comes from knowing exactly when a thing has reached its limit. Sandra picked up her wineglass. She did not drink from it. She said, I built the idea in my head that this was going to be part of our family. She set it to the centerpiece. I kept things in my mind that weren't real. That is a different thing than what she normally said, and I noted it because when a woman who usually speaks in position suddenly speaks in confession, something has shifted. I said, Sandra. She looked at me. I want Georgina to have a beautiful wedding. I mean that. But I am the one who decides what happens at the farmhouse, and I need that to be clear from this point forward. Not to anyone's disadvantage. Just clearly. She looked at the letter on the table. She looked at my grandmother's letter beside it. She did not pick up the second one. She looked at it from where she sat, and I watched her read the handwriting, Joan's slanted economical handwriting, without touching it. She said quietly, Joan wrote that herself? I said yes. 6 months before she died. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said she knew. I said yes. Sandra looked at her hands. She said, she was always a very direct woman, your grandmother. I said she was. That was the closest Sandra Holt came that afternoon to acknowledging what had been done. It was not an apology. It was a reckoning of a quieter kind, the kind that happens when someone understands they have been read accurately by someone no longer present to argue with. I did not push further. The documents were on the table. That was sufficient. Georgina was crying by the time Geoffrey brought out the pudding. Not dramatically. Quiet crying of someone who has been given a version of events and has just understood it was partial. Felix sat close to her and did not speak, which was the right thing to do. After pudding, he came to find me in the kitchen where I was washing up alongside Geoffrey. He said, Georgina and I want to find a venue that's genuinely ours to use. I said, that sounds right. He said, "I'm sorry you had to come here and do this." I said, "I'm glad I did." He said, "Joan sounded remarkable." I said, "She was." He said, "The farmhouse will be well looked after." He meant it as an observation about me rather than a reassurance about himself, which told me he had read the documents properly. We drove home at 4. Robert had been quiet through most of the afternoon and was quiet still on the road. Past Northleach the sun went flat and the fields went brown gold and the sky went the particular clear blue it goes in October when the temperature drops at the edges. He said, "I keep thinking about what Philip said. That Grandma Joan liked me." Robert said, "She had good taste." He said it without irony and then half smiled. I said, "She did." He said, "I'm going to ring my mother this week. Not about today. About the pattern. About what I've been doing when I've been not saying things." I looked at the road. I said, "I'd like that." He said, "It might be a difficult call." I said, "I know." He said, "I'm going to make it anyway." I put my hand on his. We drove the rest of the way without talking about it further, which was its own form of conversation. I went to the farmhouse on Monday morning. I had the locksmith come at 10 and change the yard gate padlock and the back door lock. I gave 1 key to Robert and kept 2. I stood in the kitchen afterwards with a cup of tea and looked at the room. The settle where Georgina had sat. Kitchen table where the wedding planner had spread her checklist. The cabinet above the sink where the gin had been opened. I put the gin back in the position it was kept. I straightened the settle cushion. I put a chair back under the table where it lived. These were small things, but they were the right small things, the equivalent of putting a tool back in its correct place in a workshop, the thing you do to indicate that the room knows what it is and has not been changed. I walked through the rest of the house. The front parlor with the flagstone floor that had been in the family photographs since the 1920s. The narrow staircase with the handrail my grandfather had made from a piece of oak cut on the farm in 1962. The bedroom at the back with the window that looked down the kitchen garden toward the field wall, where my grandmother had slept for 70 years and where I slept when I stayed over to be on site early for a job. The dairy with its ceiling that needed work. The lime plaster showing the map of what had shifted over the past 20 years in a pattern I was beginning to understand. Every room was itself. Nothing had been rearranged or damaged. They had been here for a consultation, not a removal. But the consultation had been conducted without my knowledge in my own building, and that was the thing that mattered. I put the folder of documents in the filing drawer of the desk in the small study that had been my grandmother's and was now mine, where Joan's farm records going back 40 years were kept, where her annotated copy of the Cotswolds stone handbook was on the shelf, where the framed photograph of her in the kitchen garden in 1971 stood on the windowsill, looking at something outside the frame with the expression she had when she was thinking rather than posing. I sat at the desk for a moment. I took the folder out again. I read my grandmother's letter for the first time since the week of her funeral. She had written the line I had not thought about in 3 years. She wrote, "I am leaving you this building because you will understand what it is. Not what it could be sold for or what it could be dressed as. What it actually is. A farmhouse in the Cotswolds that has been standing since 1748 and will stand for another 200 years if someone takes the trouble to know it properly." I folded the letter. I put it back in the folder. I put the folder in the drawer. I closed the drawer. I stood up and walked through the kitchen and out the back door into the kitchen garden. The beds were cut back for winter. The stone walls were the color they went in October, darker from last night's rain, almost charcoal where the shadow fell. The farmhouse behind me was warm through the back wall from the range inside. I put my hand on the stone for a moment. 1748, Philip had said, the year on the lintel stone. 300 years before my grandmother was born here. 300 years and it was still standing, and I was the one who knew how to keep it that way. Robert rang Sandra on Wednesday evening. He was at the kitchen table and I was working in the next room, and I could hear the cadence of it without the words. It was a long call. 40 minutes. The end he said, "I love you, Mum." Then he came into the workroom. He sat down. He said, "She understands. I don't know if she's happy about it, but she understands." I said, "That's enough for now." He said, "She asked if you come to Sunday lunch next month." I said, "Yes." He looked surprised. I said, "I'm not interested in a wall. I'm interested in a clear boundary. Those are different things." He thought about that. He said, "Joan would have put it exactly like that." I said, "I know." He said, "She did, actually." I know. Georgina and Felix found a converted mill in Wiltshire for the wedding. Georgina texted me in November with a photograph and an apology that was shorter than ideal but genuine enough to accept. Felix had clearly been involved in the drafting. The mill is beautiful. Stone and water, which are the right ingredients. I texted back, "It's lovely." She wrote back, "Thank you for not making it worse than it had to be." I thought about the 3 cars in the yard and the gin glass and the wedding planner's checklist and the farmhouse listed as a venue on someone's Instagram without my knowledge. I wrote back, "Enjoy planning it." And I meant it. Life is long enough for people to become better versions of themselves if someone keeps the door technically open. The dairy ceiling was repaired in November. I found the original lime plaster mix in my grandmother's records, annotated in her handwriting with the proportions she had used for a repair in 1984. I used her proportions. The ceiling looks as it would have looked in 1900. Standing in that room after the work was done, I thought about the things my grandmother had anticipated. The repair, which she had documented for me decades before I needed it. The letter, which she had placed in Philip's office 6 months before she died. The deed in my name alone. All of it prepared with the patience of someone who understood that structures fail slowly at the joints in the places nobody thought to look, and who had spent a lifetime looking in those places so that the building would hold. That is what she left me. Not just a farmhouse. A method. The habit of documentation, of preparation before need, of reading what is concealed rather than trusting what is visible. I have been doing this work for 12 years and I understood more about it after one Sunday lunch with a folder on a tablecloth than in all the years before. Philip rang in December to confirm the title register was fully updated and the supplementary records were in good order. He said, "Any further trouble?" "None," I said. "Good," he said. "Your grandmother would have found the whole thing very satisfying." I said I thought she already knew how it was going to go. He said, "I believe she did, yes. I believe she planned it specifically." He paused. "She was a very good client." I said, "She was a very good grandmother." He said, "I know." I could hear the smile in it. The folder lives in the filing drawer with the farm records. Joan's letter is in the front. The deed is behind it. Philip's copies are at the office on the high street with the brass plate outside. The farmhouse stands at the end of the lane where it has stood since 1748. I locked the yard gate this morning and drove to a job in Burford and came home this evening and unlocked it and walked through the kitchen garden in the November dark and put my hand on the back wall and it was warm from the range inside, the same warmth it has always had, the warmth of a building that has been kept properly by people who understood what it was. That is my story. A folder in a filing drawer, a grandmother who planned ahead, and a Sunday lunch where I put the structural problem directly on the table. If this reminded you that documentation is not confrontation, it is preparation, and that there is a difference between building a wall and knowing where the boundaries are, drop a comment, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.